All right. So today we're diving into something that I think is super relevant for a lot of businesses out there. We're going to be talking about subcontracting in production planning. And specifically, we're looking at this within the framework of SAP S4HANA Cloud Public Edition.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area, especially for companies that are maybe facing capacity constraints or they need some kind of specialized expertise that they might not have in-house.
Exactly. And I think a lot of businesses can probably relate to that. So basically, we're talking about how a company can leverage those external vendors, those outside experts, to really help streamline their manufacturing process, right?
That's right. And there are actually two main ways to do this, at least according to what we've been digging into. There's production subcontracting, which is sometimes called external processing, and then there's just straight up subcontracting.
Okay. And those sound pretty similar. What's
Yeah.
the main difference for you?
So think of production subcontracting as like when you outsource the entire manufacturing of a product. You're basically handing the whole thing off to an external vendor. Maybe you just don't have the capacity right now, or maybe there are some specific operational issues that make it easier to have someone else handle it.
So if I'm understanding this right, it's like I need a finished product, but instead of making it myself, I get someone else to make the whole thing for me.
Exactly. And of course, you're still involved. You're going to be providing the vendor with all the necessary components, the raw materials, whatever they need, and then they'll produce the finished product and send it back to you.
Got it. So it's not like we're just buying a finished product off the shelf. We're actively involved in the process. But walk me through the actual steps. How does this whole thing play out in the system for you?
Well, it all starts with recognizing that you need to outsource something. So you create a purchase requisition. This could be done manually, or it might be triggered automatically by MRP, Material Requirements Planning.
Right, MRP. That's the system that helps us figure out what we need and when based on our demand forecasts and all that.
Exactly. So once you have the purchase requisition, it gets converted into a subcontract purchase order. There might be some internal approval processes involved here depending on the company and the value. And once the purchase order is approved, well, that's when things really start moving.
And what happens then for you?
You're going to send out all the components that the vendor needs to make the product. So you create an outbound delivery and ship everything off.
So we supply the parts, they build the thing, they send it back. Seems pretty straightforward so far. What happens when we get the finished product back?
That's when you post a goods receipt, just like you would for any other incoming delivery. And here's where things get a little more automated. When you post that goods receipt, the system automatically records the consumption of the components that you originally sent out. So you can track exactly what materials were used and how much is left in stock.
That makes sense. It's all tied together so we're not manually updating everything. And then I guess the last step is paying the vendor.
Right. You'll receive an invoice from the vendor and process that through the system. And that pretty much wraps it up.
Okay, so that's production subcontracting. Now, you mentioned another type, just subcontracting. How is that different for you?
Yeah, so with subcontracting, you're not outsourcing the entire product. Instead, you're just outsourcing a specific operation, a specific step within your overall production process.
Oh, I see. So instead of having someone make the whole thing for me, I'm just having them do one part of it.
Exactly. This can be really useful if you have a bottleneck in your production line, like maybe a machine is down, or maybe there's just one particular step that requires specialized expertise that you don't have in-house.
So, like if we're making a product that has, let's say, 3 steps, and we're struggling with step 2, we can send that step out to someone else.
Precisely. You'd still handle steps 1 and 3 yourself, but step 2 would be handled by the subcontractor. And again, this all starts with the production order. But this time, the production order will specifically identify that one operation that needs to be subcontracted.
Okay, so how does the system know to outsource that specific step?
That's where the routing comes in. The routing basically defines the sequence of operations for making a product. And when you set up the routing for this particular product, you would use a special control key for that subcontracted operation.
A special control key. What's that all about?
So in SAP, you use control keys to tell the system different things about each operation. In this case, the control key would tell the system that this operation is going to be performed externally by a subcontractor. And importantly, you wouldn't assign an internal work center to it since it's not being done in-house.
Makes sense. We wouldn't want to schedule that operation for one of our own work centers if it's being done by someone else. But what about the materials? How does the system know which materials are needed for that specific operation?
That's all defined in the routing as well. You would assign specific components to each operation. So for example, let's say component 2 is only used in that second operation, the one that's being subcontracted. Well, you would link component 2 specifically to that operation in the routing.
So the system knows to send component 2 out to the subcontractor along with all the other instructions for that operation.
Exactly. And there's a whole set of parameters that you can define for external processing, like how the cost should be calculated and all that.
So we've talked about the process from a high level, but I'm also curious about the setup. What kind of configurations do we need to have in place to make all this subcontracting stuff work in SAP?
Oh, that's crucial. Without the right configuration, none of this would work. So first off, you need to define what's called a special procurement key. This basically tells the system that we're dealing with a special type of procurement, not just a regular purchase order.
Special procurement, meaning it involves a subcontractor.
Exactly. And then you define the special procurement types. For subcontracting, you would choose the subcontracting option under external procurement, which is designated as type F. This tells the system how to handle the external procurement for subcontracted items. You'll also want to make sure the header material master for the product is set up correctly in the MRP view. And then there's all the other master data related to production, your bill of materials, your routings, any internal resources that might be involved, and your production versions.
Okay, so there's a fair bit of setup involved, but once we have all that in place, how does the actual planning and execution work with subcontracting?
Well, for planning, it often starts with those planned independent requirements, or PIRs. Those are basically your demand forecasts. Then you run MRP, and the system compares those PIRs to your current inventory levels.
Right, MRP, that's our planning workhorse.
And based on that comparison, MRP might suggest that subcontracting is the best way to meet the demand. So it will generate either planned orders or purchase requisitions.
And we would then convert those into actual purchase orders.
Yeah, exactly. And then if we're talking about full product outsourcing, you would use the subcontracting cockpit to send the components to the vendor. You also use a specific movement type, 541, which basically transfers the stock to what's called stock provided to vendor.
So that's how we keep track of the components that are out with the vendor. And what about when the finished product comes back or when the subcontractor completes their specific operation?
Well, for full product outsourcing, you handle the goods receipt just like you would for any other purchase order. But for operational subcontracting, where you're just outsourcing a single step, the goods receipt is actually for the service that was performed, confirming that that specific operation has been completed.
So to kind of wrap this all up, we've really looked at two main ways to use subcontracting in SAP S4HANA Cloud Public Edition, right? There's outsourcing the entire product, and then there's outsourcing specific operations within a larger production process.
Exactly. And I think it's clear that both of these approaches can offer a lot of flexibility, especially if you're dealing with things like capacity constraints or you need some really specialized skills that you just don't have in-house.
This has been a really insightful deep dive, and I think the big takeaway for our listeners is to really think about how these different subcontracting models can be applied in their own businesses and even in their own industries. How can you leverage these external partnerships to really make your production process more efficient and ultimately build a more resilient supply chain? That's something to really chew on. Thanks for joining us.